All right, so we are going to be discussing this new unit of the rise of fascism. So we have moved out of the Russian Revolution, we have moved past World War I, and we're going to start with this interwar period as it's known, which is between World War I and World War II, and how it led to the rise of what we're going to talk about being fascism. So before I get started, I want to make sure to mention that a huge resource that I used for this unit was Black Shirts and Reds by Michael Parenti. It was an awesome book, and it's just a very easy read as well that really dives into not only the rise of fascism, but how it's kind of been used as that counter-revolutionary measure throughout the last 120 years. So to get going, we see that the first 21 years that separated that end of World War I and the beginning of World War II, it offered a period of great hope in Europe with different socialist revolutions for liberation going on all across Europe and in many other nations as well. But also they witnessed the capitalist-backed counter-revolutionary forces of fascism usher in this period of death and destruction. So there was a great period of expansion and hope and liberation. And like always, there's that backlash, which took the form of fascism. And so the global economy of the 20s saw capitalists making extraordinary profits until this bubble of growth ended up bursting in 1928 to 29 with the Great Depression. And so investments in big business began to freeze, which led to the loss of profits. So to keep these large profit levels, the corporations began to slash and cut wages and end up raising prices of items that they sold. The government then would provide hundreds of millions of dollars to bail out these big businesses to keep them from going bankrupt. And so in order to afford this bailout, governments would raise taxes on the working class and cut funding to social services, welfare, and unemployment insurance. Sound kind of familiar, doesn't it? Huh, crazy. And so all around Europe, the working class didn't just accept this as the way it was going to be. In fact, millions of workers created unions and political organizations to actually fight back. And so we see that workers in Germany and Italy especially led nationwide things called general strikes, where workers from all different industries, such as auto workers, coal miners, and even clothing companies, would walk off the jobs and they would actually take over the factories. And so this was extremely successful because no work meant no profits for the company owners. And so these actions won workers many strikes, won workers many wins, such as increased wages and better working conditions. And so this show of power and solidarity by the people scared the elites, so they had to respond. And they knew that they would have to strike back and abolish many of the rights that the workers had worked so hard to achieve. So their solution was to outlaw unions, communist and socialist parties, which led union organizing, and banning the right to protest itself. And so the major elites sought to put someone in power that would protect profits and interests for big businesses. And that is exactly what happened in Italy. So they were looking for a leader that would look out for big business, even if it meant hurting the workers that made the businesses all those profits. So the person that we see step into that role first was Benito Mussolini. And so he and his armed gang of black shirts was swept into power in Italy with the backing of elite bankers and industry leaders. And so in 1922, they met to plan and fund Mussolini's coup d'etat, which was known as the March on Rome. So Mussolini was able to get the backing of Italy's top military officers and police in order to lead a group of thousands, tens of thousands, in fact, into Rome. And so this resulted in a near bloodless takeover of the Italian government. And so within 2 years of seizing power, Mussolini had shut down any news organizations that criticized him. He had banned the socialist, communist, democratic, and liberal political parties, and those parties had accounted for 80% of the vote. So literally, his tiny 20% of supporters of him and people that sided with him were able to completely ban the other 80% of people that had any desire to vote. And finally, he arrested or murdered any labor or political leaders who didn't go along with this plan. So he would first keep them from voting and then completely take them out of the picture altogether. So then we saw that Germany quickly followed along the same path as Italy over the course of the 1920s. So following World War I, Germany, then known as the Weimar Republic, the W makes the V sound, became a progressive nation that wanted to take care of its citizens. But by 1930, the rich elites saw that they were losing profits and needed a swift change. So similar to Mussolini, we saw Adolf Hitler in his Nazi party was that counter-revolutionary vehicle by which rich elites could use to wrestle back power. And so companies like BMW and Mercedes funneled millions of dollars worth of funding and cars and other equipment and resources to help spread Hitler's message to the German people. And so Hitler ended up pushing a conspiracy theory called the stab in the back myth. And that blamed the Jewish people for Germany losing World War I, the economic crisis that caused millions of Germans to lose their jobs and homes during the Great Depression, and countless other issues that Germany faced. And so Hitler used racism and anti-Semitism to kind of misdirect legitimate grievances towards convenient scapegoats. So what I mean by that is they use propaganda. So Nazis such as this guy named Joseph Goebbels, which we'll look at, they tailored their message of hate to kind of appeal to different audiences. So for unemployed workers, they were told that their true enemy was the Jewish banker who made millions while they suffered. For the middle class, the Jewish union leaders and communists were to blame for them having their wages cut and losing their jobs. But in each instance, the Nazis succeeded in getting workers to blame the Jewish people instead of blaming their real enemy, which was the elites who continued to exploit them. So once again, does that sound kind of familiar, doesn't it? So despite getting millions of dollars worth of funding, the Nazi Party never actually received higher than 37% of the vote. They never received that majority of people, but they managed to receive the majority of their support from the rich, while the majority of the working class supported the communists. And so in 1932, they held a presidential election, and the moderate incumbent president, von Hindenburg, narrowly won re-election. And so rather than forming an alliance with the communists to prevent Hitler and the Nazis from gaining any support, the moderates, being Hindenburg, decided to make Hitler the chancellor, which was essentially like their vice president, because their belief was that they could, air quote, control him. They believed that they could kind of keep him in line. And as we all know, that was complete bull. And Hitler quickly took control of the government and pushed Hindenburg out of power right before he died. So within 6 months of taking office, Hitler managed to become the leader of Germany without firing a single shot or getting a majority of votes, ever. So both Hitler and Mussolini both came to power in order to take their nations back to what they call their glory days. And that means when the rich made huge profits at the expense of the workers. So when conditions of the global Great Depression caused workers to rise up and threaten revolutions, the elites pushed them into power to save society from the, threat of communism. So unions and strikes were outlawed, and property was taken from union leaders and given to the rich private owners. Minimum wage laws and safety regulations were abolished as well. Hitler and Mussolini showed their gratitude to the business elites by selling off natural resources like steel companies, banks, and factories to those business owners who had originally supported them in the first place. So taxes were also raised on the working class while eliminating taxes for the rich and other big businesses. So this resulted in tremendous profits for businesses that made weapons and other industries while the workers fell into poverty. So, dang, once again, sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? And so, all while Hitler and Mussolini were building up their military and prepping for war, because, under capitalism, they constantly have to be expanding into new profit areas. So, other nations like Great Britain, France, and the United States tried to appease or keep Hitler happy. So they hoped to give in to some demands with the promise to not, with Hitler promising to not expand any further, or in many cases, many nations actually supported the Nazis. So many European leaders saw Hitler as a protection against the spread of communism, so they were literally willing to empower him and overlook the murders that he started right when he took office. So they were willing to overlook the treatment of Jewish people and the Roma people and homosexuals, all because they wanted to, air quote, prevent the spread of communism. So all these European nations and the United States, they went along with it. Oh, also, back to these details. Henry Ford was a great example of this. He was the founder of the Ford Motor Company, and he actually admired Hitler and flew to Germany to meet with him countless times in order to make business deals. And the US media also played a huge role in supporting the rise of Hitler with their, air quote, Give Adolf a Chance program, which involved printing positive stories about Hitler and even making Hitler the Time magazine Man of the Year in 1938. So we move on to this last couple of sections talking about the belief system of fascism. And so that belief system is based on racial supremacy, sexism, and, air quote, traditional values. And so human characteristics such as class status were believed to be inherited through your bloodline, so through your ancestors. So they believed that if you were rich, it's because you inherited it from your family, kind of like the old monarchies in a way. But if your bloodline wasn't considered, air quote, pure, then you were considered undesirable and subject to extermination or exploitation. And so due to this belief, some of the Nazis' earliest victims were, as I mentioned earlier, homosexuals and those with disabilities in the eugenics program. And so throughout history, women have also tried to assert their autonomy over their bodies by having the choice about the number of children that they give birth to. But this posed a problem to the fascist patriarchy, which needs vast numbers of soldiers and workers. And so this resulted in women losing their rights over their bodies when Mussolini and Hitler and other fascist dictators took over. And I'm going to finish with a quote by Mussolini, who kind of reinforced this belief. He said, "A woman's greatest calling was to cultivate her domestic roles by devoting her time to the needs of her family while bearing as many children for the state as she could." And I'll finish by saying, taking into consideration a lot of what's been going on over the last few years, it sounds eerily, it definitely sounds eerily similar. So that's why it's so important to be able to see these commonalities and these common themes throughout history to understand how this wasn't so long ago. This was maybe a generation and a half ago that these people were in power. And so less than 100 years ago, these things were taking place. And you can see with the rise of different neo-Nazi groups across the country now and across the world, that a lot of these people still believe these same things. So we'll dig deeper into this as we go closer to the outbreak of World War II. But let me know if you have any questions regarding this activity.